So with the headlines still dominated by the Iran war, here are some of the less well-covered stories that happened in the US last week that I think are really important to know about. And the first is kind of sticking to Iran, but thinking about how the administration is trying to control the press and press reporting of it. So firstly, the Defense Department has barred press photographers from briefings on the war after they published photos of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth that his staff deemed unflattering. Hegseth then also attacked the media for not being positive enough about the US attacks on Iran. So during a Pentagon press conference, he claimed that the campaign was an unprecedented success and repeatedly accused journalists of downplaying gains on the battlefield. He singled out CNN, saying, "The sooner David Ellison takes over that network, the better." Now, Ellison is a Trump ally and donor, and he's the frontrunner to acquire CNN's parent company, Warner Bros. Discovery. Meanwhile, the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC chair, Brendan Carr, is threatening to throttle news broadcasts over what he calls hoaxes about the Iran war. So on social media, he said that broadcasters running fake news have a chance now to correct course before their license renewals come up. And his warning is coming amid sustained complaints from Trump and other members of the administration over what they call the mainstream media's coverage of the Iran war. Trump then backed Brendan Carr's threat to pull the licenses of news outlets over the Iran war coverage, saying that he was thrilled that Carr was looking into revoking the broadcasters' licenses. And since then, Trump has also called media companies potentially traitors for negative coverage of the war. And finally, Trump posted an image on social media basically boasting that he had, over the last year, defunded independent media or removed critical journalists or TV hosts, while at the same time securing allies into running key agencies and media companies who are aligned with his ideology. So moving on to health, quite a lot has happened this week. So firstly, Republican Senator Josh Hawley introduced legislation in the House to remove regulatory approval via the FDA for the use of mifepristone to end pregnancies. Now, mifepristone, when combined with the drug misoprostol, can end pregnancies during the first 2 months after conception. It's really widely used in the United States, where an estimated 7 million women have used it to terminate pregnancies since the FDA approved it back in 2000, so this is 25 years ago. And basically the bill represents further restrictions on women's access to abortion in America, and it has already quickly gained the support of major anti-abortion groups. Sticking with the FDA, it's also now no longer warning against ineffective autism treatments like chlorine dioxide and raw camel milk on its website. So what's happened is that the FDA has taken down a webpage that was warning about therapies and products making false claims of treating autism. And then an analysis published last week in the American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine found that Trump's policies on health are basically likely to drive soaring rates of lung disease and premature death in the US. And this is all happening at the same time that new medical research is being defunded. So the National Institutes of Health this week published data on its grant-giving activities last week, and it's shown dramatically fewer grants. So for instance, new grants for Alzheimer's and aging research have almost halved over the last year. The same is true for mental health research grants, and new grants for cancer research have fallen by almost a quarter. And finally, the US State Department is basically threatening to withhold life-saving assistance to people with HIV in Zambia, the South African country, as a negotiating tactic to force the government to sign a deal giving the US more access to its precious minerals. On the environment, the first two actions are about California. So firstly, the Trump administration has sued California, claiming that the state's zero-emission vehicle rules are illegal and is trying to overturn them. And then the Trump administration has ordered Sable Offshore, which is a private company, to restart its operations of the Santa Ynez unit and Santa Ynez pipeline system off the coast of California. Basically, they want to generate more oil into the system. Now, those pipelines have remained shut since the Refugio oil spill in 2015. At that time, the pipeline had corroded and it caused 142,000 gallons of oil to spill, contaminating one of the most biologically diverse areas on the US West Coast. So the pipeline has since been repaired a few years ago, but the state of California has been restricting the use of it because it still has concerns about the environmental impact. And the California Attorney General basically called Trump's executive order a brazen abuse of power. Still on kind of the oil theme, the Trump administration approved a $5 billion oil drilling project in the ultra-deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico, despite protests from Democrats and environmental advocates who says that it poses significant risks to wildlife and communities. So the Trump administration is now planning to convene the so-called God Squad, which is a high-level federal panel that has the power to override protections that are given under the Endangered Species Act, specifically around this oil and gas exploration in the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf is home to the critically endangered Rice's whale, which is a species that exists nowhere else, and there's only thought to be about 50 of the whales left on Earth. And finally, I want to talk about civil rights. So the Trump administration is giving government attorneys more power to start legal guardianship proceedings for veterans unable to make their own healthcare decisions. And what's worrying about it is people are seeing this really as a way of forcing homeless veterans and those at risk of homelessness into involuntary institutional care. Then going back to Pete Hegseth, he announced the formation of a new task force that would conduct a review of US military colleges to ensure that they are effective and focused on core national security issues. But what he's really trying to ensure is that they're not implementing any DEI practices, so diversity, equity and inclusion practices. So Hegseth said that the new task force would ensure that meritocracy was at the forefront, and he basically then said, what we've seen in our civilian institutions must never surface in our military education institutions. And if we're pulling officers out of civilian universities because they're too woke, then we better make sure our own universities are prepared to do the task properly. And finally, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination warned last week in a report that Trump's racist hate speech, anti-immigrant agenda, and the actions of ICE were fostering grave human rights violations in America. And I'll end on that cheery note. Again, all actions are available on trumpactiontracker.info, which received a big refresh last week, so do go check it out, and I'll be back in a week or so.